After my last video in which I called J.K. Rowling transphobic, a lot of people wanted to debate gender with me, specifically my gender. Now, normally I wouldn't encourage this type of behavior, and I certainly wouldn't argue, but I'm feeling generous. Let's debate womanhood, specifically mine. I'm your host, not for possession, Narcissa Deville, and welcome to hell. So this argument breaks down into two camps. In the first camp, there are people who believe that J.K. Rowling is a TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist, a word that I kind of think we need to leave in 2019. First of all, I don't think there's anything radical or feminist about trans exclusion, and I'm not even sure that we can technically classify J.K. Rowling as either a radical feminist or a feminist at all. In the other camp, the argument seems to be that sex is sex and that you can't change your chromosomes, and therefore men are men and women are women. Which honestly, I can't really argue that with you, because you're right. Sex is sex. And technically, with medical science being what it is right now, you can't change chromosomes. And honestly, yes, men are men and women are women. These things are all true. However, I think a distinction needs to be made that sex is not gender. I think one of the reasons this is a more difficult concept for some people to pick up is because we've been taught from an early age that sex is what's determined by your doctor pretty much before you're born, but also after you're born, based on the appearance of your genitalia, because, that's a normal way to classify people. The truth is, we actually don't get asked about our gender all that often, because for most people, it's sort of assumed that your sex and gender are the same. And for some people, that is certainly true. It's important to note that according to the dictionary, sex is one of two categories that living things are divided into based on their reproductive function. Whereas gender is described as either of the two sexes, specifically in reference to the social or cultural differences of how these two are raised. It's also worth noting that gender also includes a range of identities that don't include either male or female, which means that even the dictionary knows that trans and non-binary people exist. I think what's most interesting about this is that according to the dictionary, sex is specifically defined by reproductive function, which essentially means that once you're no longer able to reproduce, you are no longer male or female, which is a touch absurd. It's also worth noting the cultural and social differences described as part of gender, essentially stating that the difference between any gender is not reproductive based at all, but instead more of a social/parasocial/cultural aspect. And this is important because this conversation specifically gets brought up a lot by transphobes when they suggest that, almost specifically of trans women, that they can't ever be a real woman because being socialized as male means that you can never truly understand womanhood because you possess male privilege. There's a whole conversation that needs to be had there. Not the least of which is actually the important part about the socialization differences. Oftentimes we tell girls they should be pretty and seen but not heard, and that they really can't be anything smart or powerful or anything that isn't seen as feminine. Conversely, we often teach boys that they need to man up or not be such a sissy, suggesting that the worst thing a boy can be is feminine. This isn't universally true, but speaking personally as someone who grew up with a lot of people in my life who said things like, you need to man up and stop being so emotional and girly and a sissy. And this was often from female members of my family. When we talk about young boys specifically being socialized as male, we're suggesting that this is the same as male privilege, which it isn't. Not to mention, you're ignoring all of the boys, girls, and non-binary folk who, like me, were always a little too effeminate growing up, and were often made to feel less than because of it. A lot of times when we're discussing feminism, we often talk only about women and how they're negatively affected by the patriarchy, which is fair, but I think there's a conversation that's lacking in how men specifically are often targeted and negatively affected by the patriarchy, and sometimes even by women. When you tell young boys who are overly emotional that there's something wrong with them for being emotional, you create young men who can't properly express their feelings, and therefore situations in which your daughters are now complaining about these young men who can't properly express their feelings. And thus continues centuries upon centuries of a cycle of kind of trauma in which we tell young boys who have any kind of feminine trait or even perceived femininity that they are less than and shameful and should change themselves, and the cycle continues. And honestly speaking, if the worst thing your son grows up to be is slightly effeminate or even in touch with their emotions, I don't know how that's a bad thing. For years, even in television, it's kind of been a joke that if a boy wasn't into sports or in touch with his emotions or even slightly feminine, that he was probably going to be gay. And that's an understanding that a lot of people to this day still have. And what's interesting about that is it suggests that somehow homosexuality and femininity are intrinsically linked, which we know isn't the case. More to the point, socialization takes many forms. It can be how you're raised, but it's also a part of your friend group. For someone who has always been too feminine and mostly had girlfriends, I was always seen as one of the girls. I never really considered myself someone who even understood boys or saw myself as one of them. And so in that way, I was never really socialized as male. Even before I knew I was trans, I didn't relate to boys the way I did to girls. I loved makeup and dresses and heels, and even though these are not definitions of womanhood, they are touchstones, and touchstones that most people can relate to. When you say things like you can never be a woman or truly understand what it means to be a woman because you've experienced male privilege, it often sends the signal that there is one universal way in which to experience womanhood. I know some people like to bring up the fact that trans women specifically can't get pregnant, which is an indicator of what it means to them to be a woman. Again, bringing up the sexual reproductive aspect and not the gender aspect. Interestingly, one, thanks for reminding me I'm barren, but two, there are plenty of women who aren't able to reproduce for one reason or another. Certainly after a certain age, you can no longer produce children. Are we really going to suggest that such women who have no reproductive function are now neither male or female? Surely that's not how we want to define womanhood, right? Or maybe it's chromosomal, right? Because we love to talk about how if you have an XY chromosome, you are a man, so just get over it because nothing you do is going to change your chromosomes. Except, so hear me out here, because I have kind of shocking news for you. I don't know what my chromosomes are. And frankly, neither do you. See, we have this idea that if you have what's considered male genitalia or male reproductive organs, that you have an XY chromosome. Except science and nature are really interesting, and we know that that just isn't true. I could spend a whole video going into natural and scientific anomalies in chromosomes that lead to all kinds of things in nature, but frankly, nobody cares. Because you took a biology class in 8th grade and you learned that men have an XY chromosome and women have an XX chromosome. That means you get no changes, no refunds, no take-back or exchanges. Which, I mean, honestly, if that's how you want to view it, I'm not going to change your mind, certainly. But here's the thing. That still doesn't mean that you know my chromosomes. Because funny enough, they're not something you can actually see with the naked eye. If anything we know is that you can look female while still identifying as male, and you can look male while still identifying as female. None of these are inherently mutually exclusive. A lot of transphobic people like to pretend that they can spot a trans person in the wild, specifically almost exclusively trans women. The reality is that humans are all very complex beings, and we all look different, and so it's very possible to be a cis woman who looks a little more masculine. And this has become a problem in states like North Carolina, where bathroom bills have been enacted and butch women have found themselves ejected out of bathrooms for being perceived as male. It used to be that the Adam's apple was the big tell for a trans woman because women don't have those. Except There are a lot of cis women that I've seen personally who seem to have some kind of throat protrusion going on. And then there's me, a trans woman, with, I mean, I've never seen it. Or what about face shapes or facial hair? Because, women don't have any of that, do they? Look, the bottom line is, you don't know what my chromosomes are, and you don't know what your own are. If chromosomes aren't a good enough indication of gender, and neither is genitalia, reproductive function, or even socialization, where does that leave us? In some hellish, genderless apocalypse, as Fox News would like to think? Hardly. Here's a thought. Maybe you could just ask someone what their gender is, or what they identify as, or better yet, mind your own goddamn business. Honestly, what do you even care what a woman or a man is or identifies as? People like to use ridiculous scare tactics to suggest that if we let anyone identify as anything they want, that the next thing you know, people will identify as an animal or an armchair. Except people have been doing that for probably centuries now, because that's just how people are. And here's the funny thing. Honestly, it doesn't affect you all that much. It doesn't affect me all that much. It doesn't affect anyone all that much. If someone wants to identify as a dog or a chair or an ottoman, how does that hurt you in the least? It's a ridiculous suggestion to some, but it doesn't affect your life. In the same way, my being trans doesn't affect your life. But, I hear you cry, what about the children? Won't someone think of the children? How do I describe this to my child? I knew it would come to this. Here's the thing. You don't have to explain anything to your child. Children, I'm told, are remarkably adept at understanding otherwise complex topics that even adults aren't always the best at understanding. Funny, I know, but it happens. Honestly, the chances of your child even realizing that they've met a trans person in the wild is probably fairly low, because most adults don't recognize it, which means there would be nothing for them to explain anyway. And I feel like as a parent, there are a lot of really complex issues that you're explaining to your child every single day. So if the hardest thing you have to explain to them is that sometimes people are a different gender than what they appear to be, I really don't think that's the hardest thing you'll have to explain to your child. Try explaining trigonometry. There's also the worry that, and again, this is almost exclusively about trans women, that your daughter may end up sharing a bathroom or a locker room with a trans woman or trans girl. To which I say, maybe you and your kid just shouldn't stare at people while they change. In conclusion...
But what about the difference in strain?
Okay, so this one comes up every 5 to 6 years whenever we hear about a trans person competing in a competitive sport with someone who is cis. And the argument always goes as follows. If you let a former man compete in a female competition, they now have an unfair advantage. All right, so let's have a brief lesson in hormones, shall we? While it's true that not all people decide to medically transition, quite a few will, and a lot of that medical transition includes something called HRT, or hormone replacement therapy. Essentially, the function is as follows. You're put on a blocker for your main dominant hormone, and then you're given a pill or injection of the hormone that you're trying to get, in my case, estrogen. Estrogen has a lot of interesting effects on the body, not the least of which is loss of muscle mass and redistribution of fat. Now, this means different things for different people, especially in things like competitive sports, but essentially what that means is that someone who were assigned male at birth is going to have a different muscle mass after HRT than they would have beforehand. And in most of the cases of things like professional athletes who are trans, who are now competing in the gender that they identify as competitively, probably have undergone HRT by the time that they're there. Now, not to come off personally as a stereotype, but in my personal experience, almost every single female friend I have could have kicked my ass well before my transition and certainly could now. I realize that when we think of trans women, for some reason we tend to think of like Wesley Snipes and Tu Wong Fu, when in reality, the trans experience is as complex as the cis experience. No two trans women look alike, and therefore you have a scenario in which you can have someone like me who is not exactly the pillar of upper body strength. This isn't to suggest that there isn't a fact that men by and large can be stronger than women, and therefore that poses a danger to women. But I think suggesting that that biological reality somehow correlates to trans women being a danger to cis women is not only a fallacy, but also incredibly dangerous. Much in the same way that bees are more afraid of you than you are of them, trans women in public spaces really are trying so hard not to upset cis women. Like, you would not believe the efforts you go to just really blend in as much as possible. Because the reality is, when you upset cis women, you upset your own safety in any given space. I remember when I first transitioned, things like going to the bathroom or even trying to find a bra at Walmart were especially unnerving to me, because the last thing I wanted was to be seen and assumed as something I wasn't, and therefore attacked. The point is, when we're using the bathroom or even just trying to buy really cute, cheap lingerie, often we're there for the same reason cis women are there, to get in and get out as quickly as possible and not really to chat, especially in the bathroom. Like, I'm not here for that. Finally, just a little note on transphobia, if I may, because I think this is an important aspect of womanhood that cis women don't necessarily have to see, and they don't have to experience it. Transphobia can take many forms. Sometimes it's as simple as someone misspeaking and saying something that's unfortunate. Sometimes it's as complex as having someone misgender you or call you a name that you no longer identify with or answer to. Sometimes it's as annoying as having someone ask about your genitalia in a simple conversation that you're having with a potential date. There are lots of ways for transphobia to manifest itself, and it's a part of womanhood that I think cis women don't recognize at all. And it's fair, because they don't have to. Maybe the worst thing you can get asked by someone on a dating site is, how big are your breasts, or something sexual in nature. But it's very unlikely that someone's going to ask, how big is your pussy? It wouldn't make sense, and honestly, even if they did, you might laugh. Having a man that you otherwise found attractive suddenly ask to see your dick, or how big is it, can I suck it? Any one of those things can be extremely triggering as a woman, especially when that's not how you see yourself, and that's certainly not how you describe your own genitalia. But the very nature of the fact that online dating requires some amount of explanation about yourself means that for someone like me, and for my own safety, I tend to include my transness as a part of my profile. It's not something I'm ashamed of, but I'm very curious to know what it's like to date, or even attempt to date, without that information all over your account. Am I the foremost expert on womanhood? Well, I'm no Trixie Mattel and Katya, but I am someone who's lived a female existence for probably as long as I can remember. Sure, maybe I didn't always realize it, but I'm pretty confident in who I am. And the reality is that nobody's really an expert on womanhood, because there isn't just one experience of womanhood. Ask yourself this: how do I know I'm a woman? Is it a feeling or a thought? Or is it because someone told me I was? Or because I'm capable of giving birth? Or is it maybe just something you know, like how you know you're right-handed, or you know a song is good? Then ask yourself, is this something that needs to be quantified? Does anyone need to be able to prove what gender they are? Should that be something they need? Finally, you should ask yourself, does it really affect my life if people are trans? Because I have news for you. If your gender is in any way conflicted or contradicted by the existence of trans people, or your gender is somehow invalidated by the existence of trans people, you may not be as strong in your gender as you previously thought. Because the reality is, I know who I am. I don't need papers to tell me. I don't need doctors to tell me. Frankly, I don't even need you to agree with me. I've known who I was for quite some time now. And you should be able to say the same. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give me a like, comment down below, and keep the conversation going, and subscribe to my channel. And if you would like to see further videos like this, and just support me in general, please feel free to give to my Ko-Fi/Patreon. All the links will be in the description box below. Bye!